I will jump into it. Thank you all for coming here. Excited to talk to you about the progressive decoupling with React, Drupal, and Apache Solr. We are here at Drupal Camp Atlanta. Just wanted to give that shout out for the video. And I'm happy to be here. First time for me. And should I keep going, or was it ready to? Do I go? I didn't know if I was waiting for a cue from you. I could start over. It was 10 seconds in. Start now? Yeah. OK, great. All right. Just as excited as I was 10 seconds ago when I said I was excited to be here to present progressive decoupling with Drupal, React, and Solr, coming in from Durham, NC, myself. First time here at Drupal Camp Atlanta for anyone on my team, and myself included, so excited to be here. Traffic wasn't terrible, so I think that's a blessing as far as Atlanta goes. I'm here representing Savas Labs. We design digital products that users love. We also primarily work in Drupal, and we like to say we build Drupal web systems. I think this talk is a good example of that. It's not just Drupal, but there's various other technologies, of course, we'll get into. And we do focus a lot on more on the what we can do for organization side versus just being a technical and design implementation agency. We are hiring engineers and designers, so please talk to me after and spread the word. And again, excited to be here. Who am I? In some ways, still figuring that out, but I've been in the Drupal world for over 11 years, which sounds crazy to say out loud. I founded Savas Labs about 4 years ago, and as I mentioned, we're headquartered out of Durham, North Carolina, but we do have a distributed team all over the states. And naturally, in that transition from being in Drupal for 11 years to starting a company, I'm not as much in a technical role anymore, which brings me to my next point, to just hit you with a confession off the bat that I wrote exactly 0 lines of code on this project, but trust that I've learned enough from my teammates about how all the inner workings work. If there's any question that's above me that comes at the end, I'd be happy to take that up afterwards and make sure I can answer that well for you. And just a shout out to Ursher here, homegrown Atlanta artist, one of my favorites. Incidentally, the Confessions, if you're familiar, which I'm sure you all are, with Usher's Confessions, had nothing to do with Usher. Actually, it was a totally fabricated thing that it was somebody else that was a writer on the album. So I learned that in my hard-hitting research that I did before putting this slide together. So I thought that was funny. And also, I bet you didn't think you'd learn anything about R&B during this chat. Well, I'll keep rolling. But the main goals of getting into this is to share and inspire, obviously, try to give you guys a high-level inspiration and show how this project worked for us. This was a real-world case study with a client of ours, and I'll get into all of that in a moment. But do want to do just a quick poll of how many folks in the audience have worked with React in any way, whether through Drupal or not. So, all right, good amount. That's about 3/4. How about Apache Solr, also Drupal or not? About the same amount. OK, so there's some familiarity there. I will kind of breeze through them pretty quickly. We don't have a ton of time when I cover it, but I'll sort of assume not a ton of knowledge, so we're not leaving others behind. OK, so quickly, the case study is we did this project for a client of ours. They're called the Omega Institute. They've got a primary campus, though they have other regions, or other campuses in upstate New York. Contested whether or not it's upstate New York if you're from New York. It's on the Hudson, a couple hours north of the city. And they're an educational nonprofit. Their tagline is, "Through innovative educational experiences that awaken the best in the human spirit, Omega provides hope and healing for individuals and society." So search is really important to them because they do have a pretty broad range of people that come to their campus to seek out workshops, lots of different they have lots of different interests, but they also have quite a bevy of things that people could engage with if they were aware of them. So we kind of wanted to allow people to drill into these various topics that may be very specific to them, as well as be exposed to kind of all that goes on at the Omega Institute. So, and very specifically, a large part of their business model is to sell workshops, get people to come to campus, that sort of thing. So finding things efficiently and being able to check out and do that is an important aspect of their business. The previous search, though it was, it might be a little hard to see from if you're far back in the room, but it did have an Apache Solr back end that it integrated with Drupal. It was much like a normal Drupal search in that it had pagination. Every time you click to a new page, the page reloads. Not very dynamic, not really taking advantage of the power from a faceting standpoint that Apache Solr provides, nor the speed. And you'll see that we take advantage of both of those in our app that we built. All right, so as one should never do, I will do a bit of a demo here. So this is let me see if I can make that screen a little bit more viewable. So this is the app that we built, and I'll kind of walk through at high level, show you what it does, then we'll get into the architecture of it a bit more, and I'll come back to it quickly to kind of, again, highlight what's going on there. So everything that you see pretty much on the page, excluding the header, and we won't even have to go down to the footer, is the React app. And so all of the components in here, and we'll get into React architecture in a minute, are embodied with that React app, and they kind of cascade within one another. So I'll show you quickly. There are many different content types that, as I mentioned, is important to Omega. For example, let me just clear everything out and kind of start fresh. If you click into ideas, you can see how quickly that reacts, right? How quickly things update. If I want ideas and online learning, and I want to know about workshops, any of those three things, these tiles populate very quickly. I can clear that out. So reset the parameters. I can look for workshop dates. I happen to know that Omega is a very seasonal place, and their workshops are pretty much done for the year. So let me search in January, and okay, here are these 4 workshops. Happen to be in Costa Rica. Might be something you might want to check out in January. Similarly, you can search by location. As I mentioned, Rhinebeck, New York is their main, but they also have events in New York City. Just showed Costa Rica. So you can kind of filter on their content in those ways as well. And it all, as you can see, updates very quickly, almost instantaneously, and that it is actually hitting the Apache Solr search index each time. Let me clear that. I'll uncheck Costa Rica. We also, and we'll get into how we built out the topics in a bit, but these are taxonomy terms, and again, people have very specific tailored interests, and even would have some of these pre-highlighted for their own interests if they selected those interests on their profile, but you can drill into, I'm interested in body, mind, and spirit, or health and healing, and so you can filter on that way, in that regard too. And then, as is common in these sorts of tiling, and maybe I should just clear all, reset back to no parameters, show me more. Again, pretty instantaneous in the feeling of how quickly things load. I think the last thing I wanted to show, is the search query itself. There is auto spell checking and search suggestions. So I'll take a common example of an important person that comes to campus a lot, Pema Chodron, which some of you all may be familiar with. Her name is spelled with 1 M, but as is the case for many important people at Omega, they often have hard to spell names, and that was part of the interest in sort of helping an auto-correcting, suggesting search. So if I type PEMA with 2 M's, again, might be a little hard to see, but in here it pops up the 1 M, and therefore kind of guides people to find the content that they're looking for. And that autocomplete is handled a little bit differently than the rest of what you just saw, and we'll get into that in a moment. So let me pull that back over and keep going. Yeah, and I think ultimately the client was really satisfied with this. You know, you can read the quote yourself, but it does kind of strike that balance, as I was talking about before, of allowing people to drill into their very specific interests, but also seeing the full breadth of all they have to offer in their words. So it was something that was really rewarding for our team. It wasn't the first React application that we built, but it was really well suited to kind of intersperse with Drupal, and it was something that was really successful for the client. So keep rolling. So just taking a step back and making sure that we have the terminology covered and we're kind of talking the same language. Traditional Drupal, which probably everyone in the room is familiar with, and I'll breeze through, what is often now, when juxtaposed with headless, decoupled Drupal, called monolithic Drupal. The basic scenario here is when you have a browser, whether through your phone or computer, you're making a request that hits Drupal. Drupal's going to a MySQL, often MySQL. We'll use that as going forward as the assumption. Database that generates whatever HTML, throws that back to the browser. So it's handling the full scope of request and response. The headless world, decoupled, and those are slightly nuanced, different words. I won't get into the differences on that here, but essentially they essentially mean the same thing, where you do have Drupal as kind of a central data store, and there are disparate different devices that may read from that data store, essentially hitting the Drupal API, making a request, and then it's up to them as to how they display that request. So Amazon Echo, often given in, Dries is often referencing that response is probably going to be a voice response, right? You could have a mobile app that's reading from it, a different React application, whether mobile or not. Could be another Drupal site or a different website that's just hitting that API. So it's kind of limitless options with the decoupled and headless world. But the essential point is that Drupal is the data store, and different end devices are accessing that data store and choosing how they present it. So the progressively decoupled world, and I'll spin the little React app just so you can see it, is what we're talking about today, and it's kind of a mix of both, right? Essentially, we're rendering the entire page in Drupal, but there are interactive components within that page that are making asynchronous requests to other resources, in some cases Drupal, in some cases directly to the Apache Solr. So it kind of fits that nice mold of you get all the good stuff with Drupal, but if you have a team that's maybe not as familiar with Drupal, and it's most often a front-end JavaScript library that a team is good at building with, and you're looking for a richer, more interactive experience, you can embed those within the page, and we'll look specifically exactly how we do that in a moment. Question, Rob?
Yeah, so
and I'll repeat it.
Actually, it looks like you're about to address this question.
Okay. Such foresight.
So go to the next slide first, and if I don't feel like I've been answered, then I'll
Okay, that's fair. Just covering some of the Drupal ecosystem aspect of this. Probably most of you are familiar with core search. Comes out of the box with Drupal, the way it works. A content editor adds content, edits content, updates content on a cron run. Frequently, it usually happens once an hour. That content is indexed. Drupal has its own search index tables within the Drupal database, and that's what you query against when you're doing search on a core search Drupal. The module set that we used here, we X out Apache's Solr search module. I believe that has not been as well maintained recently, and we didn't end up using it. But the search API module is well maintained, and it allows you to interface with various different search engines.
In Drupal 8, they've formally dropped Apache Solr, and the search API is I think it's actually on trajectory to become part of core and 9.
Okay. Craig says it's perhaps going to be in core and 9, the search API module, which makes sense to me. And so that's what we used, that's what we configured, and some of these submodules are the ones that empower how we're able to interface with it from a Drupal perspective. And we'll get into that a little bit more deeply in a moment. Rob, does that answer what you were getting after?
No, it's going slightly different.
Okay.
So back to the previous slide where you were showing your React component,
Yep.
it's interacting directly with Solr.
Yeah.
What were your criteria for making that decision versus exposing views through web services or something and going from the React component to Drupal and letting it mediate all the
I will get into that very specifically in a bit, but I'll just say primarily performance reasons. You can, foregoing bootstrapping Drupal saves you 200, 300, 500 milliseconds each round trip. And so you'll see that the auto completion does bootstrap Drupal, and I'll show you in a minute how that's slower. But hitting that Solr index directly just allows it to be very app-like. It's like it's not going anywhere.
And the Solr API basically is an API, so it basically covers certain things, and if it doesn't, like the autocomplete stuff, there's native Solr.
Yep,
autocomplete.
there sure is, and we're going to get into that too. I should bring you both up here and co-present. Okay, so that's just like the module suite set within Drupal. Happy to, if people are getting ready to implement this, show you more specifics in this regard. But those are the tools that we're primarily using to empower Drupal to interface with the Apache Solr index. And similarly, as I mentioned, the Drupal core search, how that works, it's the same hooks. Anytime someone updates content or cron is run, when you have these Solr modules installed, they're aware, we need to update the Solr index as well, right? So we're kind of maintaining two separate indices here, and that's why you see the bidirectional components there. Essentially, that's how Solr's index is getting fed. And then in the previous, which I think the next slide is, how before we implemented the React application, the application did use Apache Solr search, but everything was rendered through Drupal. And again, I mentioned that wasn't quite leveraging the power or the faceting abilities of Apache Solr, and wasn't gaining the speeds that you can see from a direct connection to the index without bootstrapping Drupal at all. And again, that's the old search that performed that way. And again, if you don't get that immediate refresh. There's no show more. There's go to page 3, whole bootstrap, reload, go to page 3, right? That's how Drupal search has historically worked. All right, so we'll cover the progressively decoupled architecture. Warning, there's lots of arrows and pointy, clicky things, but I'll hopefully talk through it in a way that you get, and please stop me and ask any questions if you don't. All right, forewarned, and I did not disappoint. There are lots of arrows. So, Rob and Craig were kind of asking these questions and getting into this, but the React app, so that's what's up here, right? Maybe I'll start with Drupal. Drupal is rendering the page. There's only one line of JavaScript that is embedded, that is the React app, right? There's tons of JavaScript from the actual React, data, everything that it will process, but there's one line, and I'll show you that very line in a moment. But that's how React gets, Drupal it's just in the theme, it's one line, it's a div, it says, React.js ID, whatever it may be. And that's how React gets put on the page. But then once it is on the page and loads all the libraries, then it becomes the interactive application that it is. So that's when you get up here. When I was clicking any of the filters, excluding the search query on the side, React is hitting this very lightweight proxy PHP file that we've written custom that primarily just does securitization of the access to the Solr server, ensures that it's coming from this application and nowhere else. But it's essentially a pass-through. It's very lightweight. It's not loading anything, any large libraries or anything like that. So that's what allows it to send the request to Solr, get a very quick response, a JSON response, and I'll show you that response in a bit, and then have that delivered back to the React app so you're seeing that change very quickly. right? In the case of autocomplete, we actually did run into some limitations with implementing autocomplete on the Solr side. In other words, doing autocomplete directly through avoiding Drupal's bootstrap. So we are, as you remember, or I'll pull back up, we are using Search API autocomplete. So that, in fact, when we are doing autocompletes, that is bootstrapping Drupal. And it was a limitation of, we ran into some roadblocks with the way the autocomplete was supported, and just kind of had to make a choice to go with what we knew was tried and true in Drupal. And you can see the performance doesn't quite perform as well, but it still was satisfactory to the client.
The proxy PHP part, is that a Drupal? That's actually outside of Drupal?
It's in the, yeah, it's just in the project root. It's outside of Drupal. It's not in a module or anything. It's just a custom, again, like 100-line file that we've written and pulled from, just some basic security screening and that sort of thing. So it's very lightweight. So it doesn't really add much to the load. Let me see. I'm going to make sure I covered all the important things to say there.
So on the browser side, I see you've got 2 blocks, for lack of a better word, obviously not the Drupal
Sure.
version block, 2 chunks
Yep.
that are React things. Are you treating those as separate React applications, or do you have one initialization?
We're getting there.
Okay.
We're getting there. You're so good at that, though, predicting what I'm about to talk about. So I don't know if you can see this, but 2 points here. I mentioned, this is the main template file for this page's theme. Maybe the search template file. I'm not certain exactly what template file it is, but oops, I forgot if I clicked that would jump ahead. You can see one div. This is how React is embedded in any HTML application. So it's just one div that then gets populated and built up once the page generates. And I'll also just point out we made a decision too that the search will not work without JavaScript actually enabled. So this is the no script tag. It was kind of weighed the pros and cons and decided that the experience of trying to maintain it without JavaScript would have been too different and costly, and that vast majority, obviously, at this point, of site users have JavaScript enabled. It's not 100%, so there is a cost there, but anyway, the main point to be that just putting the React app in is a one-line div. And this may be even harder to see, but the couple things I'll point out, or maybe just one. This is a pre-process file or function, and we are loading a handful of JavaScript data into the Drupal settings variable, if you're familiar with that. The reason we're doing this is for performance reasons. So we're adding like topics and teachers and initiatives, which I may not have shown you exactly what initiatives was on the search, but we can get back to that. And is the user a paid member? So data that the React application will interface with. And again, the reason we did this was for performance reasons. Each of these would have been a separate round trip for React to call for once the page was loaded. So we said instead of doing that, let's add that to the page that it already has. The React application has access to all the JavaScript that the page has access to, cookies, stuff like that. So that was a kind of after the fact way that we figured out we could speed the page up that we added.
Drupal 6 site or 7 site?
Drupal 7 site, yeah. 22 slides in, and that finally came up. Nice. Yeah. So, yeah. I'll go back.
Content on the site somewhere else, so it's the index.
This Drupal add.js. It's not being generated. This is only being pulled out. Like these are custom, small functions we wrote to let's get the important taxonomy terms and this sort of nested structure to it. So that's just being put in a JavaScript variable on the page that React then has access to say, that's the topic list term. And if we hadn't done it that way, once the app loaded, you'd see the topics are now fading in and the teachers are now fading in, and it feels a little less app-like and a slower load.
Or on the Solr side, if you don't have, if you want to have a list of topics, but you don't have an article to the topic yet, that topic's not going to be in Solr, so you couldn't extract that from Solr. So if I say this is a list of things that I will want to have in Drupal.
All right, so I'll keep going for time reasons because we do have to cover React architecture a little bit, and I'll do pretty high level. I think I have already sort of talked through the differences here of how proxy.php works versus the autocomplete suggestion. Yeah, this is the autocomplete tile. So proxy.php is actually then hitting Drupal, bootstrapping Drupal. It's a bit slower, but it's still fairly performant and is kind of that key functionality that they were looking for to help spell difficult to spell names, essentially. All right, so we'll jump into React architecture, and then I'll kind of go back to the demo page, and we'll look at some of these things on the network tab and how they're loading to give a little bit final context to that. There are basically three important concepts from the React side. And again, 3/4 of you are familiar and have worked with React, so you frankly may know more than I do. But I'll just cover those terminologies, those terms quickly. And they are component, state, and props. And I think I'll cover it in that order. So Rob, I think you were kind of asking, is this separate apps? Is this, what does the React architecture look like? And so React has this idea of components. Components may be nested within other components. They're essentially just reusable pieces of content, that UI components that can be reused throughout. So you build it once, you can put some different properties on it, and then reuse it all over the place. So once folks get used to React, they really love that kind of architecture. It can be very efficient, easy to move things around, that sort of thing. At this, the components that we have identified on the high level is there's an app component, and you can just see by this sort of line of container that it's covering everything. Everything else is within that app component. There's a search filters component, right? So it's all these search filters on the side that we kind of ran through. Tile grid component, and then each of these individual tiles within our components. And then probably should have said first, the search results, which sort of all of them are fairly straightforward as to what they represent from their naming. And so that's a component is a very specific and integral piece of React development. And then there's the idea of state. And state is essentially if something like a button is checked or is not checked, that's the state. Like the user has interacted with it in some way and is able to change its state. And how state is lifted up in React. So if I go back to this example, say I had clicked people here, that people state, this component would change and it bubbles up to the app level. So the app is then fully aware of everything within it. This new state has happened, and then therefore can react to that. And then the terminology that they use for how you affect the rest of the UI within, where a state changes happen, is props. So essentially properties on each of these components may change. So the state, going back again, the state is clicked on people. I'll bubble that up to the app. The app knows, well, I need to pass down to this tile grid that the properties is now, filtering on only people content type, and then therefore refreshes all the UI, all the tiles within here to only show people. This is responding to those parameters. So there's that's a very high level sort of simplification. There's all sorts of libraries to interact with state, like Redux, and doing much more complicated things than we've afforded here. But those are the sort of three components of how, unfortunately using one of the words of the actual three terms, of how of the important things to take away from how React is architected. And then I think the last thing I'll mention on the architecture side before we jump back is we use the React Solr connector node package, and that got us a lot of the way there of essentially passing the React parameters that bubble up to the app they all get stored at the app level, and passing those parameters to the Solr index via the API, and coming, and receiving those back and translating that into changing properties within the UI. I'll keep going. All right, so back to the demo. Let's see if I have able to pull this over again.
Are you making separate? Are you loading in all the data and just exposing what people have selected? Or are you actually doing separate calls?
Separate calls, and again, I wish I had asked both you and Rob. Oh boy. So hopefully you can see this, and I dare to refresh because hopefully the Wi-Fi is working. Okay. So I have the network tab pulled up, and actually I'm going to clear this. Network tab pulled up so you can see, you can see what's happening while I, for example, click ideas. And if I go down to, there's a lot going on there. The most recent request to proxy.php, it sends a request, it gets a response. I think I could preview the response. So it's telling me it found 1,700 people here, and this is essentially the response that we get from Solr, right? You're looking through the JSON response from Solr that React has sent a request to, boom, comes back. And of course, this gets translated into the UI update. You'll see if I go back and do the same search I did before, Emma, that should load a different, let me see if it's hard to see the.
Are you just passing back the item ID and then looking at each item, or does that actually have enough to render the title?
We're just passing, we're passing search parameters. Like we've configured in Solr which things the Drupal content gets indexed, and probably omitted 80%, but there's only, images are important to know, and the person's name or the workshop's name, essentially anything that we may display here, information that we may need here, that's what gets indexed. So when we send the parameters, give us all the ideas, it pulls back the results. They're sorted, I think you could search whether they're sorted by relevancy and then latest first, or we can change it to oldest first. Sometimes people want to see old content.
That's usually one of the design questions is like, the search API is so flexible, you can almost put everything from Drupal into Solr. But, where's the performance? Like you could actually put the description, put the node title, the node body in Solr and get it all from Solr. Or do you get some information and go back to Drupal and ask for the information?
I might be having a network issue now, but essentially trying to show you that this request is handled through the search API autocomplete, which has its own URL within Drupal, right? As I mentioned, bootstraps Drupal, and that's why it's a bit slower. But essentially, that's how the interactions happen, right? And then I'll clear that since we have no results. And just a quick snapshot into the Solr admin. I know this is essentially showing you access to the Solr API and the sort of responses. Essentially, this response we just saw. But if I typed in Pema Chodron, and there are 40 results, and here's the kind of content, right, that's stored in the database. It's things that you would see stored in the Drupal database as well. But even, it gives you chances of what might match with it, different spellings, right? And all the terminology that someone might search for. And clearly a lot added here for this person. But just to give a sense of this is like, this is the UI to the Solr index that is being accessed via the API every time proxy PHP calls out to it. And everything's passed by JSON and then rendered by React. So I think I'll pull that back, get me back on my React slides. So I'll just cover a few challenges, considerations, and tips as we wrap, because we're coming close to here for Q&A. It's one at a time. Accessibility. So that was one thing, and this is one thing to kind of think about in any sort of decoupled architecture, whether progressive or totally decoupled, is just we're writing our own handcrafted HTML, and probably many of you haven't done that in a while. Well, those of you who work with React probably actually have, but you just have to formulate things properly, otherwise you're going to have some accessibility errors. So those are things, Drupal that generates content for you, it does a very good job at that in general. In the monolithic approach, you're in pretty good shape. But in this case, it's just something you have to pay a bit more attention to, formulating your HTML properly. Local development workflow, we made a decision, it adds complexity to now have a Java application with Solr to build on your local install. Also, we had 4 people working on the project simultaneously, so if different people had different indices that were showing different results, that would make things a little muddy. So we actually used the search index from the production site. We created a separate index and used that for everyone's local machines to hit. So, of course, you need internet for that, and there's some trade-offs there, but that was a decision we made, and just something to consider if you all work with Docker and that sort of thing. It's a non-trivial addition to get a local Solr instance working well. So it's just something to consider, and something to consider from a hosting perspective as well. Yeah.
What was your local setup since you work with Solr?
We had for this client, we have a local Docker setup, and we just, I believe people, the same way I'm accessing the index, this is actually the production index right now. It says localhost, but I'm doing like a port forwarding thing to my local machine. So I believe that's how everyone hit the index. It could be also the case that we loosened permissions on that secondary index so that it wasn't as locked down as the production one, but I'm not certain of that.
Did you guys automate? I mean, usually you've got something runs or Gulp. Basically, you've got some JavaScript build tool, and then that basically is putting it into did you put it into a separate module, or is that just part of the?
Yeah, it was an Omega Solr module, and it was, I know, and this is where my limitations are, but I know we're using Babel, and transpiling and compiling everything, and there's certainly a processor, and it probably was Gulp that packaged everything.
So it was still pretty much a manual. The developers had to remember to, create the compiled JavaScript code in your module and check it to the Drupal.
Yeah, that's probably the case. Although there were probably Gulp tasks in a Gulp file that made it just run this one command.
Yeah, keep using GitHub or whatever you might be able to do post-processing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the same sort of stuff you do with, some people do with like SAS. If you're using SAS,
yep.
Do you remember to convert it to CSS and check it in, or can whatever you're checking it in actually run SAS against what's being checked in?
And there's limitations, or there's certain formats that you have to transliterate this JS to make sure that it works in a majority of browsers. So there's certainly a whole system and suite of things we did that I can't speak to at a super deep level, but would be happy to share more after if it's helpful to anyone. Autocomplete, I kind of already highlighted. That was a bit of a blocker, frankly, halfway through the project, and we said, oh, I thought this was going to work like everything else is. Scenarios probably everyone in this room has run into on multiple occasions. So we did make that trade-off of, piping everything through Drupal, and I think for the most part, it works quite well, and fits their need. But we were a little bit like, oh man, we can't just hit the Solr index directly and make it as fast as everything else is. That's too bad. I think I did cover in that template file where we added some of the JavaScript earlier, and that was just, again, something that helped reduce the amount of round trips that the React app had to make to fetch data for its first display. And then everything else fetches live, and it goes quickly. Analytics, I didn't actually point this out super specifically. Let me just pull this back on. Oop, wrong direction. If you click any of these filters, you'll see that maybe I should have shown you see the URL is just /search, but if you click a filter, all the parameters that we do pass to Solr are now attached. I'm not sure if they're verbatim the same parameters, but we do attach them to the URL, and it's kind of 2 primary advantages. One, you could share that link with somebody else to kind of get to the same search results. as well as when people click through and do purchase a workshop or whatever it may be that they do, that's considered a conversion on the client side, specifically at our client, not to be confused with the browser client. They can track what the interactions of what were people searching for that then converted on this thing. Oh, did they type someone's name incorrectly? And it just gives a bit more data on the analytical side of things. And then the hosting, I kind of got into this a moment ago with the local setup, but there are most of the softwares or platforms as a service out there that many of us are familiar with on the Drupal side do provide some sort of Apache Solr hosting alongside what they have. We found, I think, at least 2 that had limitations that wouldn't support what we were doing. So it's just a consideration to think about that if you are going to go ahead and build something that interacts with Solr, especially if you're looking for some more complex interactions with React as well. There just could be some limitations there. And we were actually considering transitioning to one of the platforms as a service for this client earlier, around the same time we were building this, and found out that it wouldn't work for them. So it's just something to consider if you're considering.
Using a third-party Solr provider researches them very well. There's a bunch of people that are kind of fly-by-night, give you a good price, but the response time is abysmal.
Okay. Yeah, so research your Solr provider as well, says Craig. They're not all great. And I think that kind of covers the challenges and tips. And in general, just going forward, no huge takeaway, but we're happy with the app. I think it did strike that nice in between, both for the client, for what they're looking for, but where Drupal is still doing the powerful things that it can do, but also bringing in this more interactive, kind of more engaging application feel within the search page that really performs well, it's quick, and it kind of helps their business in lots of ways on the analytics front, on the ability to kind of drill into the very specific different things that people are looking for on the site. So we're excited, and I think it's something there's a lot of folks out there that, especially now that headless has been out for a few years and people have been building these sorts of tools, that do have some cautionary tales. So I think it's not all simple and easy, and you should be very aware of what you're sort of throwing out if you're not using Drupal to render everything. But we found this kind of progressive aspect to be a nice in-between that kind of fits both sides very well. Rob, it looks like you have a question.
For your facets over there on the left,
Yep.
does the node package that you found for integration with Solr feed those back to you, or were you having to do extra development to hardcode those in your app with Drupal, or like what was the relative difficulty of that versus if you were doing a passive search, just using the passive module?
Let me try to answer that and see if that answers. So essentially, did the React Solr connector help with the faceting, speak to the Solr index? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this will answer, but I'll try. But we do bubble up all the parameters at the app level, and that is the kind of one connection to the Solr index that's provided by the React Solr connector package. So yes, on each of these we probably named the variable, and that bubbles up, but it's pretty easy to translate that variable. It's probably the same naming convention than the index that exists in Solr, if that makes sense.
The underlying question is, are they true facets? So for instance, if you clicked on location, would you only see topics for that location? Or do you see all topics?
Yeah, that's something I didn't really demo, but let me I'll go over this one. It's a good question, Craig. So are they truly facets, in case it's not heard on the recording? So if you click the location, for example, if I clicked workshop dates, which I did earlier, but I didn't point this out, and again I'll do January because I know that has dates, you'll see it auto selects the workshops because that's the only thing that's relevant to dates.
If you slide down on locations, it's only showing you locations that you.
Nice.
Yep. Yeah, and if I say Rhinebeck, there I say, no, we don't have anything going on in January. It's too cold.
You're not updating the location to drop Rhinebeck.
Right, yeah, it's not fading away. But it is allowing people to say, yeah, there's nothing there, so maybe it's January, maybe you want to consider Costa Rica instead.
But there's no, I mean, yeah, there's really, it's a whippy, this design will not preclude it in there. If you want to show all of them all the time, you can.
Right.
If you want to go out and ask,
That's exactly.
so you can go directly to Solr and say, get me the facet. And that's what the Drupal facets thing is doing, is going to Solr and saying,
That's what I wanted to make sure is that some poor developer wasn't having to make sure the code base matched what was in the taxonomy. So the code base taxonomy, it should magically show.
Pulls it in.
Once an item has been indexed with that.
Right.
well,
Right.
I think in their case, it looked like they were actually pulling the Drupal taxonomy and setting it into a variable.
Doing
Oh,
that,
yeah, you're right.
that's for performance reasons, but they are indexed, so
Yeah,
that.
so basically, you know, if you add a new taxonomy, it doesn't matter whether or not there's content, it will still show up.
Right, but that ends up being a critical distinction that it's easy to overlook. Yeah. Like, where's my new term?
So that is it. I want to say thanks, and if there are any questions, happy to take them. I know we kind of did it throughout, so I think that was a nice way to do it. Any additional questions at the moment? Sure.
Any other use cases for React besides yours that like comes to your head with regular Drupal?
I think my stance is the strongest case is when it's a team that can build, whether it's an individual or multiple people that can just build, React, is familiar with React, can build in it efficiently, and you can expose the Drupal API to read from it. So this is a Drupal 7 site. Drupal 8 is even easier to expose API and integrate with it. But yeah, anything that level of interactive, it'd be hard to imagine doing that at like a theming level within Drupal. But you do have to, I don't have a great answer off the top of my head of a different use case, but that's kind of each client's needs, right? And this was very specifically tailored to being able to find content, search, and drill down in various different ways, very specifically. So that probably itself is a pretty common thing for organizations with lots of content. So.
Yeah. A lot of it's a decision. I mean, truth be known, I work on the Decoupled.org site, which uses not React but Angular to do some really fancy searching. And actually, most of the site, just by design, is generated by the heading and footer are basically Drupal, and most of the site is Angular or JavaScript produced in there. And that was one of the advantages to doing that was that our front-end designers could do HTML mockup,
Right.
show it to the client, get it approved, and then that became the template
That's done.
for the Angular, or in the case of React. So
Yeah.
it's not a case of, you've got to build it, you have to build it in Drupal, and then some CSS guy has to come through and figure out what the different Drupal tags are that need to be tweaked to make it look nice.
Yep. Yeah, limitless. They're limitless, but I guess on the spot it's kind of hard. Any other questions? I think there's somebody in here in about 5 minutes. So.
Just
I was gonna
one
say.
thing that's easier now than when I was doing it is in terms of SEO.
Yeah.
I think Bing and Yahoo finally are now doing JavaScript.
Yeah.
Before Google started doing that, you actually had to use like Phantom.js to produce a HTML version
Right.
of that.
Because otherwise, when the page was indexed, when I put in that one div, that's all that's there, right? You don't have all the content from within. And it's okay on a search page because you're just trying to find other content on a site. But if your whole site is, like you're saying, the DukeHealth.org is rendered by Angular or something that's just JavaScript, that makes a big difference from an SEO standpoint. Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. Any other questions? Yeah, all right, good. Thank you. Appreciate your time.